pussy, ass, and boobs exposed for everyone to see, like, hey, you know what I'm saying?
Hey, it's your boy, Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 100, fucking...
그리고 진짜 제가 해보고 싶은 게
No, I didn't forget that it was episode 183. I was just checking to see if you knew. Totally actually what was going on there. But speaking of prior episodes, you remember last week I said we were going to cover some of the side bands connected to Bound for Glory?
That's right, Major, you did!
I lied.
Nah, I'm just fucking with you. That's totally actually what we're going to do this week. But to properly explain these bands, we have to give some background context because nothing exists in a vacuum. If you know anything about Bound for Glory, you're aware of the fact that they're from Minnesota. If you know anything about Minnesota and kind of the upper Midwest in general, you know that there is a lot of personages of Scandinavian descent farting around up there. And given that that is in fact the case, I have a new theory, axiom, Weltanschauung, to propose to you. I call it Johansson's Law, which entails that as the concentration of Scandinavians in any given area goes up, the probability of at least some of them starting a whole bunch of fucking metal bands approaches 1. And that's exactly what happened in the upper Midwest. There actually is sort of like a Midwestern death metal thing going on in the early to mid 90s. A lot of it was centered around the fact that something called Milwaukee Metal Fest existed. And it's not like Florida where there's a whole bunch of bands because that's where Morrisound Studios was. And there's not really a united sort of sound like there was in New York, but there is sort of like a Midwestern death metal sound. And there are 2 death metal bands of note for this episode that ended up sort of weaving themselves into Bound for Glory's canon and resulted in stylistic developments that would be important in the future. The first of these was just called Brick, which is a silly name for a decidedly unsilly band playing some very technical death metal, very much comparable to another Midwestern death metal stalwart, Oppressor, that I plan on doing an episode on at some point. And this is pretty good stuff. But this band would end up bringing multiple members into the Bound for Glory extended family. Specifically, the guitarist on this album would do guest guitars on Behold the Iron Cross before joining that band full-time. That's Wayne Peloquin, sort of like the main kind of bassist guy for the latter half of Bound for Glory's career. This weird part here actually reminds me of another Midwestern band, Afterlife, from Indiana, that I also really need to cover. This weird, slow, dissonant, like spooky shit. Big fan of this. Actually, Midwestern death metal in general is like one of my favorite sort of weird sub-genres. I guess because they were more isolated from like the major coastal scenes. These guys had kind of like their own unique sound and did a lot of weird experimental shit. There's also another death metal band that was important for Bound for Glory because it gave them members, and that would be Ossuary Insane. I don't know. I'd rather pronounce it Ossuary Insane. Because that sounds like a Giallo movie or something. It's cool, I don't fucking know. But this band shared members with Brick, and then it ended up giving over 2 people to the Bound for Glory extended family. Unfortunately, neither of them are with us anymore. You got Chris Jacobson, who played with one of the major Bound for Glory side bands that we're actually going to discuss later on in this episode. And then William Hadel, who played not only with Bound for Glory, but also one of like the big side bands that we're going to discuss. Here's what Ossuary Insane sounds like. It's pretty comparable to like very early Immolation with all the weird dissonant twists and turns and the overall sort of dark feeling. You get this album and it has this like spooky, like dark blue cover with a very black metal looking logo. You put it in, it does not sound like you would expect, but I actually think the cover fits because this is some pretty atmospheric death metal. Especially in the slower parts like this. This is a really cool album. I like Brick a lot, but if you were going to get one of like these 2 bands' stuff, go for Ossuary Insane. This shit's fucking awesome. This part almost reminds me of like Innsmouth from Australia, but I mean, they didn't sound like that until 20 years after this came out. It's really good stuff. Lots of cool sort of rolling drum beats. Unfortunately, this drummer did not end up joining Bound for Glory, which sucks because I think he's really good. And actually, like the other people involved in this band that didn't go on to sort of blend into the Bound for Glory expanded universe haven't really done much since then. It's kind of a shame. Funnily enough, one of the other ex-members of Brick, after they broke up, went on to join Anal Blast of all bands. So technically, there is a 3-step connection between Bound for Glory and Slipknot. How fucking wacky is that? Don't tell Roadrunner! Uh-oh! But you got these two death metal bands giving members over to Bound for Glory, and they obviously have a different set of influences than what Ed was working with, coming out of more of like a punk background. These guys were definitely metal people, and that resulted in the two major bands we are going to be talking about today. These were bands that existed concurrently with Bound for Glory, and one of them is still around today. The first one is Before God, which has Wayne from Brick working with the Bound for Glory guys on some decidedly non-Bound for Glory sounding material. It's not very easy to describe these guys' sound. There's definitely a lot of thrash metal to it, but there's also a lot of sort of like black metal and a lot of just that like epic melodic heavy metal stuff that was big in Scandinavia at the time shows up here. And I think it's pretty interesting stuff. See, nice melodic guitars. The drums are also very acrobatic, doing a little bit more weird stuff than they would do in Bound for Glory. Very proggy sort of album, the first album they got going here. This one was called Wolves Among Sheep. It has a cover that looks like a Destroyer 666 album cover, and if you enjoy that band, you'll probably dig this. Also like this guy's vocals on the album. They're very much... They almost sound like mid-90s Marduk, but over much better music than mid-90s Marduk. And there's a lot of this sort of like weird off-time stuff going on. Very, very like, I don't know how to describe it. It's like prog, thrash, black metal, odd stuff. And this is just their debut album. They get weirder later on. Also this part right here, this riff, you heard it once before. I gotta think this album was an influence on Grand Belial's Key, if not Arguslant, because that was a total riff of that band's variety. And this came out right around when those guys were just starting to put things out. The second album, Under the Blood banner, kind of dials back a little bit of the black metal influence in favor of even more sort of tech thrash. This one gets pretty similar to Coroner. You can hear it a little bit in the weird clean guitar that just happened in your left channel speaker. But there's also a lot more melody in this album. Of the two, I think I like the second one a little bit better. This is a really cool melodic riff. Wouldn't be out of place on a Rotting Christ album, but it works really well with their more thrashy material. There's that weird spooky stuff coming back in, but they add a little extra guitar pizzazz right there. Also that was fucking weird. Wow. Heavy on the melody, heavy on these weird sort of like Coroner-esque bar chords, but with the same kind of like black metal vocals and atmosphere. Interesting band. Let's check this part out. Got that weird fucking death style flanger on the guitar. The bass takes over as the lead melodic instrument. Really weird stuff. Cannot recommend Under the Blood banner enough. Solid album. Parts like this are what I mean when they kind of dialed back sort of like the black thrash of the debut album in favor of like weirder proggy stuff. I enjoy both styles, but this one's maybe a bit more interesting and unique. Total like spiritual healing style wacky guitar theatrics. Big fan of that. And then watch what it goes into. This melodic part coming up right here. That's weird. I also love how big the bass is in this band. Very important instrument. Sort of like punching in on the beginning of each of these weird little melodic runs to give it some added percussive weight. Okay, here's that weird part again, but now it has this weird Morbid Angel kind of like crawling chug riff going on in the right channel speaker. That's interesting stuff. That sort of Morbid Angel-ish chug was a big part of Brick, and it's cool to see Wayne working that into more of like a black metal context. Solid album overall. Piano right here is cool, especially with these like tremolo riffs. Very like dissonant, spooky stuff. The piano is performing the same function as the bass did in that earlier part. Oh, that's good. That's dark. Very dark, spooky shit. Unfortunately, I think Before God is like on long-term hiatus because they haven't done anything since this album right here, which is a damn shame because they had a really unique sound. Maybe it was a little bit too unique for the metal scene writ large at the time, because I've never heard anybody talk about this band except for the guy that introduced me to them. But besides Before God, perhaps the more famous sort of Bound for Glory side band was Westwall. You remember last week I talked about, hey, put a thumbtack on that idea about the bolt thrower influence, because we're going to get to it. This is when we get to it. Westwall, like Before God before them, are big on sort of compositional dynamics and variety in songwriting. So parts like this right here, yeah, that just sounds like frantic death metal. It doesn't really sound like Bolt Thrower. It does sound good, but wait until you see what this transitions into right around now. Alright, nice chug riff. Nice full production. Cool bass sound. Okay, that's some fucking Bolt Thrower worship, and I love it. And as far as Bolt Thrower worship bands go, I enjoy this a hell of a lot more than like War Master. Honestly, this was actually my introduction to all of like sort of the Bound for Glory extended family way back when. I didn't even know what Bound for Glory was back when I first heard Westwall. All I knew was they sounded like Bolt Thrower. And I like bands that sound like Bolt Thrower because Bolt Thrower is a fucking cool band. Also, really quality vocals in this band, if you couldn't tell. Heavy groove influence. Very good gym band, just like Bolt Thrower. Also these very cool sort of like layered melodies with chugs under them. Interesting stuff. Not really as much to talk about with this band compared to Before God. Before God, you can say all this like weird shit about the different guitar styles they're using. Westwall, all you can really say is, yeah, they're a great fucking band. They're like Bolt Thrower, but racist. To be fair to Westwall, they don't sound exactly like Bolt Thrower. They kind of got their own thing going on. They're a lot more sort of like epic, a little bit less Horrors of War, a little bit more Forged in Glory. And there's also sort of like a spiritual connection to the past that isn't really as much a part of Bolt Thrower. These are cool melodic riffs right here. Also another band that either may have influenced Argosland or may have been influenced by them. But yeah, this right here, that's a Bolt Thrower riff. Really like them weird little melodic layered bits they do in the middle of very chuggy riffs. Interesting stuff. Also awesome fucking vocals. He sounds like somebody in between maybe like early Johan Haig and Amon Amarth and maybe a Massa Broberg back when he was the vocalist for Cryptopsy.
아 이거는 못 고르지.
Cryptopsy, Hypocrisy. I meant Hypocrisy. How many fucking Opsy bands we got around here Anyways, Westwall's a cool fucking band, and I believe they are, in fact, still active and possibly touring. This is a cool little build-up right here. This, like, marching sort of, like, speeding up drum beat. Really good, like, groove riff. And watch this little break here. This is sick. That's good stuff. Big-time mosh fodder, this band. Highly recommend picking up all 3 of their albums if you can find them. And then we get to a slightly weirder case of what initially my research had led me to believe was a Bound for Glory side band. See, there's this band from Poland called Hussar, and at least on Metal Farchives, they're described as a collaboratory side project of members of Bound for Glory and members of the Polish rack band White Devils, with the Bound for Glory guys doing all the vocals and the White Devils guys playing all the instruments. And, you know, that would seem to make sense given that this appears to at least have been heavily influenced by Westwall and Bound for Glory, and possibly even Before God. It's this really like groove-heavy, sort of vaguely melodic, but also very brutal death metal. And it's a solid fucking album, this Hussar project. Really good stuff. Also, it's got the great vocals that you'd come to expect from a Bound for Glory side project. But then you listen to the Vanessa Stally Hearts album that came out the prior year from White Devils, and it sounds
Fucking like, like some like...
the same album as Hussar. Because guess what? Hussar is not a separate band. Hussar is the name of a White Devils album. It's the English language version of Vanessa Stally Heart, featuring guest vocals and different lyrics from the Bound for Glory guys. Okay, honest mistake. And maybe, maybe this album is like a different style from other White Devil stuff. Since they're described as a rack band, they're not on Metal Archive. You gotta think maybe this Hussar bit was sort of like a death metal side project. You wanna hear what most White Devil sounds like?
Hey, you want to see something really cool?
Oh gee, what do you fucking know? It sounds exactly like that Hussar album. It's almost like White Devils is totally actually a real metal band that should be on that fucking website, but they aren't because they're a bunch of leftist goods. It's not that unusual for a right-wing Polish band to do an English version and a Polish version of an album. Graveland did that all the time. So that's that confusion sort of demystified, okay? Hussar is not a band, despite what anybody tells you. The band is White Devils, and the English language version of their album, Vnas Stali Heart, is entitled Hussar, and it features different vocals and lyrics from the Polish version provided by members of Bound for Glory, Before God, and Westwall. Okay, we've got that cleared up. And as you heard from those samples, it's good fucking stuff. Which version should you get?
Well, you douchebags!
I prefer the vocals on the English language version myself, and that's kind of like the major deciding factor between the two releases. Like, those are good vocals. He sounds like, I don't know, fucking fascist Barney Greenway or something. Really cool stuff. Also great melodies as always. Like I said, this one definitely seems to have been influenced pretty heavily by Bound for Glory and Westwall and Before God. And it's a good one, particularly during the more melodic moments such as this. Good riffs. The clean vocal sections are interesting on the English language version because it's fucking Joel from Bound for Glory, alright? That's interesting. You wouldn't expect to hear that on a Polish rack album. Is it rack or RAC? I don't know. I kind of like the way rack sounds, so I'm going to stick with that. But yeah, that's a cool album. However, the Polish version does have one thing going for it. It's got one extra song called The 7th of July, the 2009 version, so this is a re-recording of an older song, and this is a pretty cool song. It reminds me a bit of Sokira Peruna from Ukraine. It's sort of like hyper-melodic, kind of very emotional, rack-influenced, melodic, black death, whatever metal. Interesting stuff, and it's worth getting the Polish version of the album just for this song, because it's cool. But yeah, that's the main difference between Hussar and Vnas Stali Heart. The English language version has the death metal vocals. The Polish language version is a bit more normal rack sounding with these more sing-along type vocals. They're both great, and you should check them both out. And do a little compare-contrast for yourselves. Not only are the vocals and the lyrics different, but they actually move around where the vocals happen in the songs and the different versions. It's interesting. But Hussar is definitely not some weird separate band. It's just a case of ideological brothers helping each other out across country lines. So now that we've thoroughly chronicled all of the Bound for Glory guys' adventures in the more extreme avenues of metal, what did this mean for Bound for Glory? Well, a lot of that like melodic black metal stuff and death metal stuff, the overall heaviness bled back into Bound for Glory sounds, resulting in the newer Bound for Glory albums sounding a little bit different than the old stuff. For instance, this is their most recent album, Ironborn, and you can hear a sizable amount of folk metal influence in what's going on here, and it makes sense because he was hanging out with all these like Eastern European rack dudes, and Ed's always seen wearing like Incifrum shirts and shit. That blends into the sound a bit. The old Iron Maiden influences are still there with the guitar harmonies, but there's more of like a extreme metal heaviness to it, even if it still sounds like Bound for Glory. You can tell it's still down, especially with Joel's unmistakable vocals. But overall, there's a pretty interesting journey through Bound for Glory, and then all of the different like side bands and how they fed back into the main band. A lot of cool stuff, a lot of good stuff to listen to. And if you haven't listened to any of it before, I urge you to check out at least some of the bands and albums I've covered the past couple weeks. I'll see you next week with more stuff.
Fart porn, that's a thing. Some hot chick in fucking tight spandex fucking bends over and rips ass. Oh yeah, baby. I made it nice and juicy just for you.